Welcome back to Programming with Qt Widgets. We have seen models. Oh yes, a lot of models, and especially how to implement them. We have seen proxy models. We have seen a bit of the views. Well, basically we've just seen that we can instantiate either a tree view, a table view, or a list view. But what we're missing is the delegates. So what is the purpose of the delegate? Well, starting again from the bottom of this illustration here, the data, that's your satellite flying around, orbiting Earth, whatever. And if you don't understand that reference, you obviously jumped into the middle of a training session. Anyway, that is your data. The model, that's the part that is translating it from however your data is represented onto something that the view and the delegate can understand. And what does the view do? Well, the view is asking the delegate to paint everything, and then it figures out where should the data be positioned. So if you scroll it a bit down so that you are at 257th row, then it will ask the delegate to paint the data for that index. And the delegate is finally the piece that does the actual hard work. It's the piece that I'm going to ask the model for the background role and the foreground role and the font and the color and whatever needs to be done. And if you should double click on a cell in a table, for example, then the view will ask the delegate to edit that data. And the delegate might not, or most of the time does not edit the data itself. It creates an editor. That could be a line edit for a piece of text, or it could be a spin box for an integer, or for your own data, you might bring up a combo box or an editor for money instances, or whatever your application is about. So what are our options? Well, we'll subclass from one of three classes. QAbstractItemDelegate. You need to do a lot of work, I think, because I never tried actually subclassing from that one. Then there is QItemDelegate or QStyleItemDelegate. And if you go to the documentation, it will tell you that QStyledItemDelegate should be the default for new delegate, and the QItemDelegate is only for a transition period. Well, I beg to differ. And this is where you say, yes, but can you please elaborate? And I'll gladly do. How about half an hour? Is that enough elaboration? Because that's exactly what I did some time ago in Qt Widgets and more. There's a link below telling you much more about that, where you can understand, where I'll explain why I think that QStyledItemDelegate is the wrong default, and you want to have QItemDelegate being your default. Actually, in there, I develop a whole framework that I suggest that you cut and paste out of it, which gives you at the least amount of code to implement when you're implementing delegates yourself. So when should you not be instantiating or implementing your own delegates? Well, there's a number of good reasons for when you shouldn't, a number of good examples where you shouldn't, and you can see them down here. If you want to change the color, the font, or, well, any of those things, there's no reason for you to implement a new delegate. You can just let the regular delegate take care of that and simply return a different color or a different font from your model in the data method. If you want to add checkbox, well, just one icon or one checkbox would be weird with multiple checkboxes, but a checkbox or one item, well, then use the item or one icon, then use the item roles instead. Rich text, multiple lines with different data, yes. And if you want to do something that is completely different from a regular editor. So for example, I have a very, very simple editor for editing money value. So I have a class called money. If I want to edit that, well, I need to edit the amount and I need to edit the currency. And obviously, I do not offer all the currencies in the whole world, just those that are interesting to us. Euro, dollar, pound, Swedish kroners. So I have a combo box, or well, something that resembles a combo box for the currency part, and a spin box for the amount part. And that is an example of delegate. I was talking here about the editing part, but also for the painting of it, my delegate will get an instance of a money class, and will go and know exactly what to pull out from that one. So that's another good example of a delegate. I will tell you for almost an hour about delegates if you go to Qt Widgets and more, where I have 3 episodes that talks a lot more about delegates. But I'll just go over the surface in this episode here. I hate to say it on this channel, but widgets is not the solution for all the problems out there. If you want something that is more touch-friendly, then QML might be a better solution for you. But if you already have lots of lines of code written with widgets, then what do? Well, as always, you call KDAP. There's either a lot to be said about delegate or very little to be said about delegate, depending on how much detail you want to go into. I'll delegate to Qt Widgets and more for the a lot part, and just show you a simple example here of implementing a delegate. Let me just say up front here, I did not write this code, but I didn't bother actually fixing it up. So I'll let you go through the pain of looking at this code here. I have in my main.cpp, I created a table view. That's what you see over here. And the table view is creating an instance of a standard item model. It iterates from 0 to 100 and creates this formatted string, which is 30%, for example, this text that you see there. It creates 3 columns. Why it does that with 3 times here rather than just with a loop, I don't understand. Why does it do it for 3 times? I don't understand. But in any case, it creates a model here, or it appends a row to the model. And if you don't understand what Q standard item model is about, then please rewind and see that episode where I talked about that. It then sets a model. And the important thing, of course, is the BarGraphDelegate. The BarGraphDelegate looks like this. It's subclassing from QAbstractItemDelegate. I said that I never seen that done, so now I have, I guess. I think I said I never done it, which is still true because I didn't write this example here. It implements 2 methods here, paint and sizeHint. And again, this one doesn't do anything. So had this been recorded after 2011, I would likely have said using QAbstractItemDelegate : QAbstractItemDelegate, but that's okay. Anyway, here's my paint method. And the paint method, what it does is that it tests whether the type that comes in the user role here, .userType, that's a way of asking for whether that variant holds a user type of, or the type of int. And if that is the case, and as you can see, deprecated, I wouldn't do that these days. What I do is I take the integer out. So it's kind of weird because either my delegate are loosely or are very tightly coupled to my data, in which case I know there is an integer in there, or it's not coupled at all, which means that I can't assume anything about the data. And here we're sitting a bit in between, which is just kind of weird. Anyway, I take the value out, which is like 30 for 30%. I take the option.rect, the option that's the Q style option view item, really easy name to say. It holds information about whether the item is, what the rectangle of the item is, and let's see a few other examples, whether the size and the font, and if decoration should be shown, and so on. In any case, I go and ask the option for the rectangle. That is the cell that I currently want to paint in, and I ask for it to be adjusted +4, +4, -4, -4, which basically means shrink it in a bit. And if I go and show you here, you can see it starts 4 pixels from the left and from the right, which is a nice usage of QRect API. I set the width of my rectangle to be the rectangle width multiplied by the value divided by max value, and that max value, that's 100, so I can show it in percent. Again, why wouldn't I just have 100.0 written here? Why wouldn't my value be 0.3 rather than 30? Lots of questions. I paint, or I fill the rect here. That's how I get this rectangle filled. And with a steel blue, and it's get darker and darker the higher values I get. And finally, I paint the text inside here, the 80% and the 90%. And I do that by going and asking for the display role. Yeah, that's basically what there is to it. What you notice and what you should take away from here. Oh yeah, the size hint, of course. This is the thing that makes it show up in this particular size. If I hadn't implemented size hint, it would be smaller. But of course, it still works as it is after all. Just a hint, a size hint. Okay, so what you should take away from this is that I can override a paint method. The paint method takes a painter and some information about what where to draw it and the font and so on, and an index. And actually, the font comes from that index. The QStyle option view is usually set up from that index to start with. And that's gonna get you well through 95% of your style or your delegate needs. The remaining 3% is for editing delegate, and then there's 2 for super user delegates. And for that, I urge you in any case, to go and watch those episodes on Qt Widgets and more about delegates. One thing we didn't discuss was how do you actually get your delegate to do the work. Well, you can either, which I would say is uncommon unless you are implementing a spreadsheet or something similar to that, you can either ask it to be instantiated for the whole widget or the whole view to be accurate, because this is a Q abstract item view thingy. And you do that by simply saying view set item delegate with a delegate. And then all the cells in the view will be painted and edited using that delegate. What you more likely will do is either to instantiate your delegate on a particular column. So you have some data where everything in that column is shown in the same format, or you will set it for a row because you have something where a specific row needs to be painted differently, say should be indicating that it's a header row in your table or something like that. And in those situations, set item delegate for column or set item delegate for row. And let's start there. I have an example now that I'd like to show you. And let's start there with how do you set the delegate. And as you can see here, I create an instance of a country delegate, and I call list set item delegate for column. Column 0 has this delegate. And that is done for a list and for a table, and further down for a tree. And you can see that I can, for column 1, it is the default delegate of a spin box. For column 0, it's a combo box where I can choose a different thing. So I don't know, was that Sweden that was now all of a sudden migrated to be Great Britain? And you can see it updated there and there. As soon as I clicked outside of the item here, which meant save it, this is the point when I click outside. That's when the data is committed back to the model. The model will have the set data called upon it. Okay, let me scroll up here so that we can actually see what it takes to implement such a delegate. The delegate here is subclassing QStyle item delegate, and as it doesn't do any painting, that is perfectly fine. The grips I have with a QStyle item delegate is for the painting part, not for the editing part. Of course, this delegate could have done some painting too, which would then likely have been better done with the Qt Widgets and more delegate class that I implement as part of Qt Widgets and more. In any case, to implement an editing delegate, what I need to do is implement 3 or 4 methods for this. The first one is create editor. That is called whenever I click here, an editor will be created. And then that editor will be populated with the data from the item, from the index here, which is done with setEditorData. And when I'm done, when I click outside it again, the data will be copied back into the model, and that is done using setModelData. So let's see the implementation of each of those. First, the create editor here takes a parent, which is the view over there, style, option, view, item, which is basically where I can go and fetch that data that we saw before from, and the index in case that would matter to me in this situation. As you can see, neither the option nor the index is of interest to me. I'll create a combo box and I'll return that combo box. In the past, I would also call install event filter, but this must be at least Qt 4 days because nowadays the Qt does it for me already. So I shouldn't do. If I do, then I'll just get the event filter called twice, which wouldn't hurt, but it's no use either. Then I call setEditorData, and setEditorData, well, I don't, but I implement setEditorData, which takes this combo box that was created for me up here. I cast it to be a combo box again. I populate it, and I was actually a bit puzzled because I would think, but it turned out that wasn't true, at least not as of today. I would think they would reuse this editor here when I clicked different places, but it seems like I get a new editor. I think that to be 100% safe, I would start clearing off the combo box, because had they reused the editor, I would get add items multiple times, which means that the list of countries would be multiple times. Anyway, I go and ask for these countries. I don't know why I have country delegate : in front of here as a static method. I am in a country delegate, so no reason to do that. But anyway, ask the countries, ask for the index of the data that I have here. And that's the index of the current country to be selected. And then on that one, Poland, Holland, you'll see it's the default here, or the selected one. When I click it, I call combo box set current index. And once I'm done editing and click outside again, set model data will be called. Here I go get my combo box, and now model set data. Remember, we saw that we needed to implement set data, taking an index and a value, and potentially also a role, but I don't need to specify that role. So model set data, and that's how I take my model and set that value back into the index. The final part that I miss is that I optionally can implement updateEditorGeometry. And updateEditorGeometry is actually the newest part of this slide. I updated that code just before going on here because I was starting wondering, how about, because the original version of that one only took care of the height and not the width, and it didn't take care of the boundary conditions. But I'll show you right now. So what the updateEditorGeometry is taking care of is to update the geometry as it says on the editor, because by default the editor that is returned from created editor will be sized to the size of the cell that it's editing, which means, as you can see over here, if I click on USA, it will take the combo box will take exactly the size of the cell, which is perfectly okay, except if I do like this and I double click on Holland, then that would be a pretty annoying editor to edit. So the default is edit in the cell, but I would like to do it better than that. That's where I resize the editor, and it will be placed on top of the child here, which is the viewport of the Q abstract item view. So that's perfectly okay to paint and put it on these pixels there. And that's exactly what I do here. So let's walk through the code. I go and ask for the cell size. So the rect of the cell here, that's this size that I have here. Then I ask my editor, what size would you like? That's this one here. And I figure out what size should it get. And the size of the editor should be the maximum width of what it would like, and the cell, that's the width of the cell. So if the if the editor would like less than the width of the cell, then it should get the width of the cell. And if it wants more, then it should get that more. And same thing for the height of the cell. And next I figure out, so is there any delta in this? So I ask for the size of the editor and the size of the cell, and I figure out, okay, where should the editor be positioned then? Well, it should be positioned at the top left minus the delta in width and height. So if there is an offset there, if it wants to paint outside, then it should basically be centered inside of the cell. And that's what I do here with this line. But there is a boundary condition of what happens if I am all the way at the size here or the edge here. You can see if I'm editing, well, you can see if I do like this. Whoop. Editing, it'll go, if you zoom in on your screen, you'll see a few pixels above and a few pixels below. But if I do the same up here and I edit, then it will not go above because that's outside of the area. It's only the grid area in here that it can place itself on, because that's a parent of it. This one here is a sibling to the editor at this point. So I clamp the position to be within this size here, and then finally I set the geometry of the editor to be this. Why didn't they do that? Well, I don't know. They didn't, and then they didn't get back and think about it. But now you have this code, and I urge you to cut and paste that into updateEditorGeometry for any editing delegate that you will have in the future. So the final piece that I will implement here is a way for changing how the delegate or the editor moves on once it's done doing its work. So if I click on USA here, or double click for me to edit it, and I press arrow down, you can see I'll go to the next item in my combo box. But if I press enter now, it will accept that item as being the new item, Great Britain here, but it will not move onto the next cell to edit. And that might be a feature that I need, and certainly I can handle that. I can fix that. I'll simply implement an event filter. And Qt already installed the event filter for me on the editor. So now what I need simply to do is to implement my event filter. And if you don't know what an event filter is, it's a function that gets called whenever an event comes to the widget before the widget gets a chance to act on it. I test whether the event is a key press and it's a return. In that situation, what I need to do now is to act as the delegate itself would have done upon ending editing, namely emit the data or emit commit data, which tells the view that is listening, or the view that created this delegate, that, hey, I'm done and you should take my data and put it into the model. Actually, what you should do is that you should go back and call the method that I implemented up here, the set model data, and possibly do something else, if that was the only thing I could have called that myself. And then also emit close editor, and close editor signal brings out a enum telling what should you do next, namely edit next item or it. Okay. I have a problem. It could be edit previous item or submit model cache. I have no idea what that means, but in any case, and then return false. That's the event filter saying you don't need to tell the actual editor about this event. And otherwise, definitely make sure that the event filter superclass is being called, because the QStyle item delegate will, for example, handle the escape key, among other things. That's it for this episode of Programming with Qt Widgets, but there's more to learn about delegates, and I've put 3 links below to Qt Widgets and more, where you can learn much more about item delegates, at least get a deeper understanding for what goes on, and especially the painting part. If you want to paint more than just the cell, if the cell should be editable, for example, or selectable, well, there's more to learn, but at least you got the basics by now. Until next time, have a great time.